She wasn't supposed to speak to him. Those were the rules. But when the black maid whispered a question no one had ever asked the millionaire's disabled son, his fingers twitched for the first time in 17 years. By nightfall, the boy's first word would make headlines. And by morning, she'd be facing arrest for saving him. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Carrington mansion rose from the Georgia soil like something torn from the pages of a luxury magazine. A 15,000 square foot fortress of glass, stone, and steel perched high above a manicured lawn. From the road, the walls gleamed like polished mirrors, reflecting the late morning sun and the restless clouds rolling over Atlanta's most exclusive suburb. Inside, silence moved like a second inhabitant, filling spaces too wide for sound to settle. In the heart of that silence lived Landon Carrington. At 17, he had never taken a single step. Born with a rare neuromuscular condition that doctors had diagnosed within hours of his delivery, his life had been shaped by immobility before it had even begun. The newspapers called him the boy in the chair, a soft headline that carried more pity than curiosity. People who knew of the Carrington name imagined a lonely heir surrounded by wealth, shielded from the public, caged in privilege and tragedy all at once. From his window on the second floor, Landon could see the circular driveway below, where imported cars came and went, where landscapers moved in choreographed silence, and where strangers were greeted with a smile that rarely reached the eyes. He watched them the way other boys might watch sports, detached, from a distance, knowing he would never enter the game. His father, Richard Carrington, built the family fortune on hard acquisitions and harder negotiations. He wore his authority like tailored suits, custom, crisp, and without unnecessary details. Richard believed time was currency, and emotions were liabilities. In boardrooms, he was feared. At home, he was absent in everything but presence. When he did speak to Landon, his words were stripped to utility. Sit up, stay focused, don't let them see weakness. His mother, Vivian, had perfected the art of appearance. She was a socialite in the truest Southern tradition, gracious in public, calculating in private. She curated charity galas that drew Atlanta's elite, her photographs always catching the light just right. But when the cameras stopped flashing, her affection for her son was measured in clinical gestures, adjusting the blanket over his lap, checking the schedule for his physical therapy, reminding staff about his medication. She spoke to him with the same tone she used with caterers, polite, efficient, unyielding. The Carrington household ran like a well-oiled machine, and the people who kept it running were mostly back. They moved through the mansion in pressed uniforms, heads slightly bowed, their footsteps softened by Persian rugs. They knew their boundaries, both spoken and unspoken, and the unspoken were always the sharper kind. None of their birthdays were remembered, no family photographs included them, and their names were rarely used outside of instructions. In this home, they were hands, not people. Landon noticed. He always noticed. His nurse, Marjorie, a tall woman in her late 50s with the posture of a soldier, tended to him with the efficiency of a factory line. She timed his breathing exercises down to the second, monitored his vitals with an unblinking stare, and recorded progress in medical jargon no one ever read aloud to him. If she had any warmth, she kept it locked away. To her, Landon wasn't a boy, he was a project to be maintained, a chart to be updated. Some days, Landon wondered if he'd ever been allowed to simply be. His life was a sequence of scheduled therapies, monitored meals, and expensive machines that hummed in the corners of his room. His wheelchair was state-of-the-art, built from carbon fiber and whisper-quiet motors, but it still felt like a cage. The outside world saw the Carringtons as a family who had done everything money could buy for their disabled son. Specialist flown in from Europe, rehabilitation programs that cost more than most houses, cutting-edge treatments trialed years before they reached the public. And yet, for all of it, Landon remained bound to the chair, his muscles stubborn against science, his voice barely more than a breath. Richard took this as proof of what he already believed. Some things could not be fixed, and effort beyond a certain point was wasted. Vivian dressed it differently, speaking of accepting reality at charity luncheons, but the core was the same. They believed Landon's fate was sealed, written in his fragile bones before he ever opened his eyes. What they didn't believe, what they never imagined, was that the greatest shift in Landon's life would not come from another doctor, another machine, or another check written in a trembling flourish. It would come from someone whose name they didn't even plan to remember. That morning, the mansion was quieter than usual. The hum of the appliances felt heavier in the air. Downstairs, in a back hallway far from the Carringtons' line of sight, a woman stepped through the service entrance. She carried a small bag and a folded employment form, her steps steady despite the faint wariness in her eyes. Her name was Naomi Brooks, and though no one knew it yet, she had walked into the Carringtons' house carrying a history, one written in struggle, in persistence, and in a truth that had nothing to do with money. The household staff barely glanced up as she signed in. Another hire, another set of hands to dust the edges of a life too vast to touch. They couldn't know that her arrival would mark the first crack in the mansion's silent, polished walls. Upstairs, Landon sat by his window, the sunlight painting pale streaks across his skin. His wheelchair's motor clicked softly beneath him. Somewhere deep inside, where words could not yet escape, he felt the faintest pull of change, like air shifting before a storm. The Carringtons believed they had seen every possibility, exhausted every outcome. They didn't yet see that the most unlikely one had just walked through their door, and in less than 24 hours, Naomi Brooks would stand in Landon Carrington's room, and he would look at her in a way he had never looked at anyone before. The call had almost been enough to stop Naomi Brooks from coming at all. She had been sitting at the kitchen table of her modest two-bedroom apartment on the city's south side, the cordless phone pressed between her shoulder and ear as she folded a stack of laundry. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret, the Carrington estate's head housekeeper, crisp-clipped and carrying that peculiar tone Naomi knew well. It was the tone people used when they wanted to sound polite but still remind you exactly where they thought you belonged. Mrs. Carrington likes staff who blend in, Margaret had said after reading Naomi's resume. You know, quiet, not distracting. We've had issues before. There was a pause, deliberate and heavy. If you understand what I mean. Naomi understood perfectly. She had worked long enough in other people's houses to recognize the coded language, the words that carried a second meaning under their skin. Blending in meant knowing your place. Not distracting meant not challenging their comfort. For a moment, Naomi had stared at the shirt in her hands, its faded cotton soft against her palms, and thought about telling Margaret she could keep her job. She didn't need to walk into another house where her skin was a warning label before she even set foot inside. But then she remembered the envelope on her counter, the rent bill stamped in red, and the slow ache in her knees from the double shift she'd worked the day before. Survival had a way of pushing dignity into the background, so she went. The Carrington estate looked even more imposing up close. The wrought iron gates opened soundlessly as her old sedan approached, the guard barely glancing at her as he waved her through. The driveway curved past manicured hedges and fountains that seemed built more for display than for beauty. She parked at the rear service entrance, as instructed. No one had told her there was a separate entrance for staff, but she wasn't surprised. She'd seen it before. Naomi stepped out of the car in a plain navy skirt and a cream blouse buttoned to the collar. Her shoes were sensible, her hair pulled neatly into a low bun. She carried no perfume, no jewelry, beyond a small gold cross her grandmother had given her at 17. Her appearance spoke of quiet professionalism, but her eyes, warm, sharp, and unyielding, carried a story far heavier than her modest frame. Margaret met her at the door. She was tall, thin, with hair pinned so tightly it looked painful. Her gaze flicked over Naomi like a scanner, taking inventory. This way, she said, turning without offering a handshake. They crossed through back corridors, lined with polished floors and silent rooms. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish, and something floral, expensive, but impersonal. In the study, Richard Carrington sat behind a dark walnut desk, tapping at a tablet. He looked up briefly, his expression unreadable. Vivian stood nearby, her posture poised, a thin smile on her lips. Margaret announced Naomi, with the same tone one might use to introduce a delivery. Richard glanced at Naomi for no more than 2 seconds before returning his gaze to the tablet. She's not the type we usually hire. Naomi didn't flinch, though the words landed sharp. Vivian tilted her head. Richard, her voice was light, but there was a firmness beneath it. We've been waiting 2 weeks to fill this position. It's just housekeeping, not, she glanced at Naomi, anything public-facing. Richard's jaw tightened. We need someone who blends in. Naomi said nothing. Years of practice had taught her that responding too quickly, defending herself too sharply, often gave people the excuse they were looking for to dismiss you. She let the silence stretch. Vivian finally sighed. Fine. We'll try her for a month. It wasn't an offer. It was a command. Richard leaned back in his chair, dismissing Naomi with a flick of his hand. Margaret led her back toward the rear hall, muttering a list of duties. Dusting, polishing, laundry, and don't touch the boys' medical equipment. She spoke as if Naomi were already part of the staff. No need to check if she accepted. As they walked, Naomi's thoughts drifted to her grandmother, Evelyn Brooks. Evelyn had marched in Selma in 1965. Her feet blistered, her hands blistering still from holding on to signs too long in the southern sun. She'd told Naomi that surviving in this world was a two-step dance, one foot planted in dignity, the other in necessity. Sometimes, she'd said, you had to let necessity lead. Naomi had worked for people like the Carringtons before. She had been invisible in kitchens larger than her entire apartment. She had cleaned rooms where the owners didn't bother to remember her name. She had been given leftover food in foil, spoken over in conversations she was standing in, and once memorably told to use the back staircase because the front is for guests. But she also carried something none of them could take, a patience born of storms, and a belief, however faint, that her presence could matter, even in small ways. Her first shift passed quietly. She dusted glass shelves lined with artifacts from countries the Carringtons had probably visited for weekends. She folded linen softer than anything she'd ever owned. She passed other staff members in the hall, most of them black, who offered polite nods but avoided lingering. Late in the afternoon, Margaret handed Naomi a small list. Guest rooms upstairs. And don't disturb the boy. He doesn't like strangers. Naomi took the list without comment, but as she climbed the wide, carpeted staircase, she felt the air change. Cooler, stiller. The upstairs hallways were quieter, the doors heavier. She moved from room to room, her work efficient, her hands steady. But when she reached the last door at the end of the hall, she hesitated. It was slightly ajar. Inside, a shaft of sunlight stretched across a polished floor. Pushing the door open a few inches, she saw him. Landon Carrington sat by the window in a sleek black wheelchair, his profile framed by the afternoon light. His skin was pale against the dark leather seat, his hair falling softly over his forehead. He didn't move when she stepped inside, but his eyes did. They locked on her instantly, sharp and startling. It wasn't the distant, unfocused gaze she expected from someone described as not liking strangers. It was direct, searching. Naomi froze. She had been in countless rooms like this, with countless employers' children who barely noticed her. But this boy was watching her, and not the way the wealthy sometimes watched. Not with judgment, but with a strange, unspoken curiosity. She glanced toward the hallway. No one was there. Hello, she said softly. Landon's gaze didn't waver. His hand twitched against the armrest, just slightly, but enough for Naomi to notice. She took a single step closer, her instincts telling her this was not the moment to retreat. Somewhere behind her, faint but unmistakable, she heard Margaret's voice calling her name. But Naomi didn't move, because in that instant, she knew something she couldn't explain. This boy saw her in a way no one in this house had. And in the next heartbeat, Landon's lips parted, as if he were about to say something, though the Carringtons had told everyone he couldn't speak at all. Naomi stood just inside the doorway, her hand still resting on the edge, the faint creak of the hinge the only sound in the room. Landon's eyes didn't flicker toward the door, or the hallway behind her. They stayed locked on her. There was no polite hesitation in his gaze, no automatic glance away like the staff downstairs gave each other in passing. It was a steady, deliberate tracking, as if he had been waiting for her to arrive without even knowing who she was. She stepped further inside, her shoes barely making a sound against the thick carpet. The air here was cooler, infused with that faint, sterile scent Naomi recognized from hospital corridors. On her list, dust shelving was the only instruction for this room. She moved toward the far wall, where a glass shelf displayed neat rows of books, their spines so pristine she doubted they'd ever been opened. The weight of his gaze followed her. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't frightened, but it was intense. Afternoon, she said quietly, testing the air between them. No response. She glanced back, and their eyes caught again, the way sunlight catches the edge of glass, sharp enough to sting. She noticed now how still he was, save for the subtle shift of his eyes tracking her movement. His lips were closed, his jaw set in a way that made him look older than 17. From the hallway, the rhythmic click of heels approached. The nurse, Marjorie appeared in the doorway without knocking. Her voice clipped. "You're dusting? Good. Don't get too close to him. He doesn't like strangers." Her tone wasn't a warning for Naomi's safety. It was a reminder of her place. Naomi smiled faintly, the kind of smile that meant nothing and everything at once. "I'll be careful." Marjorie left, her heels clicking away. Naomi waited until the sound faded before turning back toward the shelf. In the quiet, she began humming. It wasn't something she planned. The tune slipped out as her fingers traced over the row of books, an old melody her grandmother used to hum while cooking on Sunday afternoons. A song without words, full of the rise and fall of a story only the listener could finish. The sound seemed to shift the air. Naomi felt it before she saw it. The smallest movement in her peripheral vision. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see Landon's right hand twitch against the armrest of his wheelchair. Not a spasm, not the involuntary jerks she had seen in people with nerve damage. This was intentional. She kept humming, softer now, like coaxing something fragile into the open. Landon's fingers twitched again, and then again, almost like they were tapping in rhythm. Naomi's chest tightened. She had read enough about conditions like his to know how rare voluntary motion could be, and how quickly it could disappear if not encouraged. She moved to the second shelf, humming still, dusting slowly so she wouldn't have to turn her back completely. His eyes never left her. Downstairs, muffled through the thick walls, she heard the faint sound of laughter. Vivian's voice, sharp and bright, entertaining guests. It felt like a different world entirely from this quiet exchange upstairs. For years, Naomi had been invisible in the homes she worked in. Even when people looked directly at her, they didn't see her. She was a moving set of hands, a uniform, a function. But now, here was a boy, a white millionaire's son no less, looking at her with something like attention. No, not just attention. Recognition. And that was dangerous. Not for her, she could handle whatever subtle punishments the Carringtons might think up for overstepping. But for him, in this house, connections like this weren't just discouraged, they were quietly erased. She turned toward the window to dust the sill, her hum trailing into silence. When she glanced back at him, his eyes didn't look away. They held hers with a weight that made her throat tighten. It was as if he was trying to tell her something without words. Naomi remembered something her grandmother once said. Some people speak without their mouths. You just have to be the kind of person willing to hear them. She put the cloth down, wiped her palms on her skirt, and stood there for a moment, feeling the room's stillness wrap around her. The safe thing, the rule-following thing, would be to leave now, finish her list, move on to the next room, pretend nothing had happened. But Naomi had never been good at pretending things she felt. She stepped closer to his chair, slowly, carefully. From this distance she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the faint tremor in his lower lip, the thin scar just beneath his chin. She could also see the faint, almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders, the kind that comes from being braced against disappointment for years. "You're watching me like you've got something to say," she murmured. His gaze sharpened, and for the first time she saw the corners of his mouth shift, not into a smile but into the faintest suggestion of one. Her pulse quickened. "Is that true?" she asked softly. "Do you?" His hand moved again, this time not a twitch, but a slow, deliberate shift of his fingers curling inward. Naomi inhaled sharply. That kind of movement, precise, timed, wasn't something his nurse had mentioned in her brisk list of instructions. She was about to speak again when she caught sight of something in the hallway, a shadow just beyond the doorframe. It lingered for a second, then disappeared. Someone had been watching. Her heart gave a small jolt, but she kept her expression calm. She had learned long ago that the walls in houses like this didn't just hold up the ceiling, they carried whispers from one room to another. She turned back to him. His eyes hadn't moved. For the first time, Naomi realized she didn't feel like she was looking at him. She felt like she was looking with him, as though the two of them were standing together, facing the rest of the house as a shared thing. And in that moment, she made a decision that broke a rule so deeply ingrained in this home. It might as well have been carved into its marble floors. She would speak to him directly, personally, not as an employee to an employer's child, but as a human being to another human being. Naomi leaned in just enough for her voice to reach only his ears, and the words she was about to say would set in motion a chain of events neither of them could have predicted. Naomi leaned in until the afternoon light brushed across her cheek, close enough that the faint hum of the wheelchair's motor was the only sound between them. Her voice dropped into that calm register she used with nervous children in grocery stores and frightened strangers on buses. Do you want me to move you near the window? For a moment, nothing. His gaze stayed locked on hers, unreadable. Then 2 deliberate blinks. Naomi froze. In her first day briefing, the nurse had told her, his signals aren't consistent. Don't try to interpret them. It'll only frustrate you. The tone had been matter-of-fact, as if Landon's inability to communicate was settled law. But those blinks hadn't been random. They were measured, spaced just enough to feel like intent. She lowered her voice further. That means yes, doesn't it? The smallest flicker passed through his eyes. Not quite relief. Not quite surprise. But something that lived between them. Naomi straightened, her decision already made. All right then. She reached for the chair's handles, her palms warm against the cool carbon fiber. The machine was heavier than she expected, its quiet hum deepening. As she released the brake, from the hallway came the click of approaching heels. The nurse's voice, sharp and disapproving, sliced through the air. What are you doing? Moving him, Naomi said without turning. That's not part of your duties. He doesn't I think he'll be all right. The nurse's silence was loaded. Naomi could feel it pressing against the back of her neck, but she kept moving. She steered him toward the window where sunlight pooled like gold on the floorboards. As the chair's front wheels rolled over the edge of the carpet, Landon's head tilted slightly toward the light, a small, instinctive gesture. When she stopped, the sun hit his face fully for the first time since she'd entered. His skin, pale from years indoors, caught the warmth as if it had been waiting for it. And then she saw it. The corners of his mouth, not forced, not tentative, eased upward into the faintest, purest smile. It wasn't wide. It wasn't practiced. It was the kind of smile that slipped out before a person realized they were doing it, born from something unguarded. Naomi's throat tightened. This was the part they never told you in job interviews. The weight of moments no one else noticed, moments you had to carry quietly because speaking of them might make them vanish. The nurse shifted behind her, but for once said nothing. Better? Naomi asked softly. 2 blinks. She allowed herself the smallest smile in return. Thought so. Footsteps approached from the far end of the hallway. This time the rhythm was slower, deliberate, the kind that announced a presence before the person arrived. Vivian Carrington appeared in the doorway, her fitted cream dress catching the light like polished bone. She took in the scene with one slow sweep of her eyes, the chair by the window, the sun on her son's face, the maid standing behind him. Her gaze landed on the smile still clinging faintly to Landon's lips. Something in her jaw tightened. Well, Vivian said finally, stepping inside. You seem brighter today. Landon's eyes flicked toward her, then back to Naomi. Vivian's smile was polite, but her eyes were not. Naomi, is it? I hope you're settling in. Yes, ma'am, Naomi replied evenly. Vivian's gaze lingered a second too long, then slid toward the nurse. He's not overdue for any medication. No, Mrs. Carrington, the nurse replied quickly. Vivian's eyes returned to her son. She crouched just enough to smooth a non-existent wrinkle from his sleeve. We wouldn't want you overexerting yourself, she said. Her voice sweetened in a way that made the words feel like glass pressed against skin. She stood, turning back toward the hallway. Enjoy the light, darling. Naomi, carry on. When she was gone, the air seemed to ease, but only slightly. Naomi moved back to the shelves, but she caught Landon still watching her. That smile, small but sure, remained. The rest of her shift passed without incident, though she could feel the nurse's eyes on her longer than before. By the time the sun dipped low and the house settled into its evening quiet, Naomi had finished her list and was making her way toward the back staircase. She didn't hear Vivian approach until the voice came, low and precise, from behind her. Naomi. She turned to find the lady of the house standing in the dim hallway, arms folded, one hand clasping her elbow as though she were keeping herself from something stronger. I appreciate your enthusiasm, Vivian began. But I must be clear. Your duties here are to maintain the rooms and follow the established routines. My son's care is handled by trained medical staff. Do you understand? Naomi kept her expression neutral. Yes, ma'am. Vivian stepped closer. And I expect my staff to respect boundaries. It's important for everyone to stay in their lane. That way, there are no misunderstandings. Naomi knew exactly what that meant. She had heard it before in other houses, from other women who never raised their voices but knew exactly how to push someone back into their place. "Yes, ma'am," she repeated, her tone unchanged. Vivian gave a thin smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes, and turned away. Naomi stood for a long moment after she left, the polished floor cool beneath her shoes. Then she walked toward the service corridor, her mind already made up. She would not ignore the look in Landon's eyes that afternoon. She would not pretend his smile hadn't happened. She would not step back into the role of silent shadow. If anything, Vivian's warning had sealed her decision. The next morning, Naomi planned her tasks with one quiet, certain goal: to find another way to reach him, no matter what rules she had to break. Morning in the Carrington mansion moved like a finely tuned procession. Coffee cups landed on saucers without a clink, newspapers folded themselves into angles, and staff crossed paths, like intersecting shadows. Naomi learned the tempo fast because the tempo had teeth. The written handbook fit on one laminated sheet. The unwritten rules filled the hallways. Workers ate at a small table in the basement pantry, knees brushing mop buckets, backs to a wall that had never seen sunlight. The family's dining room was cathedral large, yet not one of them, cook, gardener, driver, had ever been invited to sit there. Speaking to the family required a preface of "excuse me," followed by a pause long enough to be ignored, and the rule layered on everything else like lacquer. Medical decisions were never to be questioned. The phrasing made questioning sound like theft. Naomi recognized the pattern with the ease of muscle memory. In a previous house, she had been told to use a side path because the main walk is for guests. In another, a mistress whispered, "Don't wear red lipstick. It draws attention." The language shifted from place to place, but the meaning stayed the same. Blend, hush, disappear. The boundaries were racial even when they were painted as professional. Standards had always been the prettiest costume for hierarchy. She swallowed it the way one swallows a bitter pill, without liking it, because she had to. Yet something about Landon's faint smile by the window made the rules feel flimsy, like tape over a door that wanted opening. She planned her days with small detours: a dusting past a fraction slower, a laundry delivery timed for when the nurse stepped away. No grand defiance, just gentle pressure against the seam. On the second morning, Naomi wheeled a cart toward Landon's room, with folded linen stacked like white bricks. The hallway was empty. She knocked once, softly, then slipped in. Landon sat angled toward the window, the blinds still half closed. His eyes found her, fast and sure. It felt less like recognition and more like relief. "Good morning," she said, voice low. "Sun or shade?" His blink came, 1, 2, measured, and certain. "Sun." "Thought so." She opened the blinds halfway and angled his chair so the light brushed his left cheek. The skin at the corner of his mouth reacted first, a barely there softening. Naomi's breath steadied. The nurse's schedule was precise. Stretches at 10, vitals at noon, meds at 3. Naomi scanned the clock and carved out the space between. She reached for the arm of his chair, paused, and then spoke, as if asking permission mattered, which it did. "If I hold your hand, is that all right?" She lifted her palm an inch in offering. 2 blinks. Her fingers closed around his warm, fragile, present. She gave a light squeeze. Once. Yes. Twice. No. She showed him, slow, repeating, her voice keeping cadence with the pressure. 1 for yes, 2 for no. "If that works for you, blink once." 1 blink. Clean as a bell. Her heart climbed into her throat. "Okay," she whispered. And though the room was quiet, the word felt like a door unlatching. They built a language from scraps. Naomi offered choices like stepping stones. Window or door, music or quiet, book or nothing. He answered with blinks. When he wanted the blinds raised higher, his finger edged toward the button but missed. She took that motion as a sentence. When she moved too fast, his jaw tightened. She slowed and watched the tension fade. In 10 minutes, the room shifted from medical to human, the way a face changes when a person remembers they are safe. At 9:55, the nurse's footsteps approached. Naomi let go of his hand, straightened the stack of linens, and adjusted a vase that didn't need adjusting. Marjorie entered with a tablet, and the sort of smile that always meant the smile wasn't for you. "You're early with linens. Helpful." "Trying to be," Naomi said. Marjorie brushed past, checked cables and tubes that no longer connected to Landon, but stayed anyway. like relics of a former faith. We don't want him overstimulated, she added, a phrase that sounded medical and felt moral. Routine matters. Naomi nodded, her face a portrait of compliance while her mind held on to the signal of 2 steady blinks. When Marjorie finished and left, Naomi returned the blinds to where Landon had wanted them, just a touch more light, and saw gratitude flicker behind his eyes. By the 3rd day, Naomi had learned the geography of the room, what the cameras could see and where reflections fell. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. A mirrored frame near the wardrobe threw back just enough of the ceiling corner to show a small dome glass black eye-like. She pretended not to notice. Naomi had cleaned enough mansions to know privacy was a privilege reserved for those who signed checks. She found her first unexpected twist that afternoon, while straightening the closet. On a top shelf behind stacked board games with unbroken seals, lay a thin plastic case covered in a film of dust. The label read in blocky print, "Picture board, basic needs." Naomi's gut tightened. She climbed onto the footstool, pulled the case down, and cracked it open. Inside were laminated cards. Water, bathroom, pain, yes, no, simple line drawings with bold words. A Velcro strip ran along one edge where a pointer could stick. She remembered similar boards from a senior home, improvising with magazine cutouts when the printer broke. They were crude and invaluable. For a boy without a reliable voice, this was a lifeline. Abandoned. Naomi slid the case under her stack of folded towels on the cart and rolled it out like it was nothing. In the hall, Margaret appeared, a ledger in hand. "You were headed down?" "Yes, ma'am," Naomi replied with pleasant blankness. "Good, and keep the boy's room quiet this week. He's prone to fatigue." "Of course." Naomi carried the picture board to the laundry room and wiped each card with a damp cloth, drying them in neat rows. The ritual felt holy. If rules existed to maintain silence, then tools like this were her hymns against it. She reintroduced the board the following morning. With careful choreography, she placed 3 cards, sun, quiet, water, on a tray, and slid it onto Landon's lap like she was laying out silverware. "Blink once for the one that fits," she murmured. "Or try to touch it if you can." His eyes tracked deliberately. Sun. 1 blink. Then, a second later, his right finger lifted. Not far, not clean, but enough to graze the edge of the sun symbol. A spark ran through Naomi, so bright she had to swallow it down before it turned into sound. "You're doing this," she breathed. "You are." Progress demanded hiding. She stashed the board under the cushion when footsteps neared, returned the room to sterile order, and held their new language in the quiet between schedules. The speed of Landon's answers increased. His eyes found symbols faster. His finger corrected course when it drifted. He wanted sun often. He wanted music sometimes. He wanted water not because he was thirsty, but because the act of choosing soothed him, choice after years of being chosen. Meanwhile, downstairs the house rehearsed its hierarchy. Workers ate without lifting their eyes when Richard passed. The gardener, a quiet man named Jonas, told Naomi in a sideways voice about a staff member fired the previous year for overfamiliarity, a catch-all sin. He asked a question. Jonas said. Wrong person heard him ask it. He shrugged like a man forced to make peace with weather. Naomi stored the warning beside all the others, and kept going. When Landon's fingers trembled too hard to choose a card, she offered yes, no, and let his eyes answer. When his eyelids fluttered in frustration, she lightened the choices to success-proof the moment. Every day the distance between who he had been told he was and who he might be narrowed by an inch you couldn't see until suddenly you could. At noon on the 4th day, Vivian drifted in with a florist's arrangement big enough to block a window. Peonies are hopeful, don't you think? She said, positioning the mass directly between Landon and the light. His expression thin. Naomi waited until Vivian left, then nudged the vase 3 inches to the side. The beams returned to his cheekbone. A new rule wrote itself. Hope, here, would be measured in inches reclaimed. Naomi, Vivian called later from the landing. The tone sugared and deadly. Your polish left a film on the banister. Please use the approved brand. The comment wasn't about polish. It was the liturgy of her authority. Naomi apologized with perfect posture and switched to the approved bottle, which smelled identical and likely cost triple. That evening, in the staff pantry, Cook Gertie set a bowl of soup near Naomi's elbow and whispered, You're pushing air differently up there. She didn't elaborate. Naomi didn't ask. She simply said, Thank you. and ate slowly, listening for what wasn't said. The next morning delivered both grace and risk. Naomi arrived early, carrying a small Bluetooth speaker in her apron pocket. Music wasn't forbidden, but joy often was, so she framed it as cleaning efficiency. Helps with polishing, she told Margaret, who was too busy checking deliveries to argue. In Landon's room, she placed the speaker by the window and cued the kind of instrumental that sounded like breathing. Soft guitar, a thread of piano. His eyes shifted toward the sound, then toward the board. She set 2 cards down, music and quiet. One blink for music, then a finger, lifting with stubborn care, tapped the edge of the note icon. Naomi let the guitar thread fill the room until the air felt less like hospital and more like a porch at dusk. "You look lighter," she said, testing a new word in the space between them. His jaw eased. His gaze found her. He blinked once, then held the blink a fraction longer, as if underlining the yes. "Okay," she whispered. "Then we keep going." They practiced a pattern. Naomi asked, "Do you want to try lifting your arm to touch my hand?" One blink. She placed her palm a few inches from his fingers, thinking of it as a horizon he could reach. His hand rose, trembled, faltered, and then landed, feather-soft, against her skin. The contact lasted less than a second, but it landed like thunder inside her chest. "Landon," she said, unable to contain the awe. "You just did that." He blinked once, fast, then again slower, like a smile in the language they had invented. The door opened without a knock. Richard Currington stepped in, expression unsmiling, his gaze immediately sweeping the room with the instinct of a man who had built a life scanning for weakness. The music was quiet enough to pretend it didn't exist, but not quiet enough to be ignored. The picture board was hidden, but Naomi's hand still hovered midair as if memory held it there. Landon's cheeks were warmed by light and effort, small signs that meant everything to people who were looking for them, and nothing to people who weren't. Richard took in the tableau, Maid near his son, their proximity intimate in a way that looked dangerous inside the story. He preferred. His eyes hardened. What exactly is going on in here? Naomi lowered her hand, slow and measured. "Dusting, sir. And adjusting the blinds. The light helps." Richard's gaze slid to his son. "You look flushed." He shot a look toward the hallway. "Marjorie." Footsteps answered from down the corridor. Naomi felt the picture board under the cushion. An inch from discovery, felt the heat still lingering in her palm from Landon's touch. Landon's eyes darted to hers, not in panic, but in question. What now? Richard stepped closer to the chair, noticing a fraction too late to pretend otherwise. The faint curl of Landon's fingers, as if they had just been in motion. Suspicion sharpened his voice. "Naomi, what did you do?" Before she could answer, Richard's gaze snagged on a lamination corner peeking from beneath the cushion. White, glossy, printed, and his hand reached down to pull it free. Richard's fingers closed over the corner of the laminated card and pulled it free. The sun symbol glared up at him in bold black print, the Velcro strip frayed from recent use. He turned it over once, as though the meaning might shift if he stared long enough. Then his gaze rose to Naomi, hard and sharp. "What is this?" "A picture card," Naomi replied evenly. "For communication." This was not in his current therapy protocol. Richard's voice carried the clipped authority of a man accustomed to obedience without explanation. "Where did you even find it?" "In the closet," Naomi said. "It was covered in dust. I cleaned it up." You thought wrong." The words cut across hers. Final and absolute. He tossed the card onto the side table, as though it carried something unsanitary. These tools were discontinued for a reason. His medical team determined they weren't productive for his progress. Naomi's eyes flicked briefly toward Landon, whose gaze hadn't left her. The faint tension in his jaw was more telling than any speech could have been. "With respect," she said, steady and calm. "Progress isn't just about muscle strength or medical benchmarks. He needs dignity. Attention, to feel seen." Richard gave a low, humorless laugh. "Dignity doesn't come from children being coddled. It comes from pushing them to meet their potential, not indulging every..." His eyes flicked to her uniform. "Whim of the help." Naomi felt the words land with the weight of every other time she'd been reminded of her position. Her skin, her place in the invisible hierarchy, but she kept her voice level. "I didn't indulge him. I gave him a choice. Something you can't buy with all the wealth in this house." For a moment Richard's expression didn't change. Then his jaw tightened, his shoulders squaring like a man about to close a deal. "You are here to clean and maintain order. You are not here to play therapist, nurse, or, God forbid, friend." Naomi absorbed the blow without flinching. Understood. But inside, she was making the same note she'd made since day one. In this house, the boundaries weren't about safety or structure. They were about control, about keeping every interaction transactional, especially when it came from someone like her. Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the air between them feel heavier. "People like you should know your limits, Naomi. You step beyond them, and you won't be here long enough to regret it." There it was, not shouted, not crude, but precise and deliberate. The racism in this house didn't need to wear the old masks of slurs or open hostility. It was built into the architecture, polished into the rules, dressed in expensive suits. Naomi let the silence stretch until Richard stepped back, straightening his tie. "I'll have Margaret reassign you to the guest wing for the rest of the week. Someone else will handle his room." Landon's eyes shifted sharply toward his father, then back to Naomi. She could almost feel the unspoken protest in the air, but he had no words to put to it, at least, not yet. Naomi nodded once, not because she agreed, but because in houses like this, nodding was survival. "Yes." Richard left without another glance at his son. The click of the door behind him felt heavier than it should have. Naomi busied herself gathering the laundry she'd brought, keeping her movements slow so she could stand near Landon for just a moment longer. "We'll figure this out," she said under her breath, unsure if he could even hear her over the hum of his wheelchair's electronics. His eyes softened in a way that told her he had. That afternoon she was sent to dust the guest rooms, far from the second-floor corner where Landon's room sat. Every pass of the cloth across polished wood felt like an exile sentence. The other staff avoided conversation. Word of Richard's temper moved faster than the vacuum lines in the carpet. By the time evening rolled in, the air outside the mansion had turned heavy with summer humidity. Naomi lingered in the staff pantry, sipping tea from a chipped mug and pretending to review the next day's schedule. She wasn't ready to return to her small apartment, to let the day end on Richard's terms. When the household began settling for the night, she slipped quietly up the back staircase. The halls were dim now, shadows stretching long across the walls. She moved with the ease of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. Steps light, breaths shallow. Landon's door was cracked open. Inside, the only illumination came from the moonlight spilling through the blinds, casting silver stripes across his face. He was awake. Naomi stepped inside without speaking. She didn't touch the chair, didn't move the blinds, just stood close enough that he could see her in the shadows. "Hi," she whispered, and for a moment she thought that would be all. Then, so faint she almost thought she imagined it, came a sound. A breath first, then the smallest shaping of lips, the rustle of vocal cords straining against years of disuse. It wasn't a full word, not yet, but it was more than silence. Naomi froze, her chest tight. "Landon?" she asked softly, leaning closer. There it was again, fragile and raw, almost a syllable, almost nay. Her heart pounded. It wasn't just that he had tried to speak, it was the timing. Hours after his father had ordered her out of his life, he had chosen to break the silence for her. Naomi stepped closer, ready to hear him try again, unaware that just outside the door, someone else was listening. Naomi held her breath, leaning close enough to feel the faint warmth of Landon's exhale against her cheek. The moonlight cut across his face in silver lines, his eyes locked on hers, unblinking. His lips moved again, slowly, as if every syllable had to be coaxed from deep inside, past muscles that hadn't been asked to work in years. The sound came ragged at first. A breath scraped into shape, a tremor of voice like wind through a cracked door. "Nah." Naomi's heart lurched. "That's it," she whispered, her voice steady even as her chest tightened. "Take your time." His brow furrowed, the effort visible in the small strain of his neck muscles, the way his jaw trembled under the weight of trying. He drew in another shallow breath, eyes never leaving hers. "Nah, oh, me." It wasn't perfect. The consonants blurred, the vowels caught, but it was whole enough for the meaning to arrive like a thunderclap. Naomi's lips parted. For a moment she could only stare at him. "You said my name," she breathed, the words breaking in the middle. Her instinct was to look away, to blink the moisture from her eyes before it spilled over. But she didn't. She let him see her as she was, stunned, honored, and entirely unprepared for the force of the moment. The weight of it pressed down harder when she thought about what it meant. Years of medical experts, therapists, and family had tried to coax a word from him, and now, the first to hear his voice, the first word he had ever spoken, was her, a black woman in a house that made her presence an afterthought. She swallowed the lump in her throat, not because the emotion was too much, but because she knew what this could become if it reached the wrong ears. The Carringtons would never frame this as his progress, not if it meant crediting her. They would fold it into some narrative about their investment in his care, erasing her entirely. Still, she couldn't let the moment pass without marking it for him. "You did that," she told him softly, leaning close. "You spoke, and I heard you. I will always hear you." The corners of his mouth lifted in a faint smile, not the shy, fleeting one she'd seen before, but something warmer, almost proud. His gaze seemed to hold more weight now, more intense. Naomi thought of her grandmother, Evelyn, who once told her, "Sometimes history happens in kitchens and quiet rooms, with no one to see it but the people it's meant for." They stayed like that for several minutes, Naomi whispering encouragements, Landon trying the name again. The second time came easier, still fractured, still soft, but more confident. "Now. Oh. Me." She nodded, beaming, despite herself. "Yes. That's me." But the fragile cocoon they had built was about to split open. From the hallway came the faintest shift of floorboards. Naomi's ears caught it instantly, her years in service teaching her the difference between an empty hall and one holding a listener. She straightened, glancing toward the door. Nothing moved, but the shadow at the edge of the threshold lingered too long. She turned back to Landon, lowering her voice even further. "We'll keep practicing, but for now we stay quiet. Okay?" His eyes flicked toward the door, then back to her. He blinked once. They had no time to seal the moment. The nurse, Marjorie, stepped into view, her arms folded, her gaze a mix of suspicion and something sharper. "What's going on in here?" Naomi kept her posture neutral, her tone mild. "Just checking the blinds before bed." Marjorie's eyes moved from her to Landon, and for the first time in Naomi's presence they widened. "Did you just—" Landon didn't look away. He didn't repeat the word, but his expression held the echo of it. The nurse's tone shifted into a kind of urgent disbelief. "Say it again." Landon stayed silent. Marjorie's attention swung back to Naomi. "How long has this been happening?" Naomi chose her words carefully. "He's been responding more." Marjorie didn't wait for more explanation. She stepped back into the hall, already pulling her phone from her pocket. "Mrs. Carrington needs to hear this." Naomi's stomach tightened. She knew exactly how this would play out, not as a moment of triumph for Landon, and certainly not as credit to her. It would be staged, spun, claimed, and once the family took hold of it, whatever fragile trust they'd built could vanish under a wave of cameras and false gratitude. She looked at Landon, lowering her voice to a whisper, meant only for him. "Whatever happens next, you remember who you spoke to first." His gaze didn't waver. From down the hall, Naomi could already hear the clipped echo of Vivian's heels approaching. The door swung open, Vivian's eyes sharp with curiosity, and something told Naomi this would be the last moment she and Landon would have alone for a very long time. Vivian swept into the room, as though her presence were the natural conclusion to any significant event. Her eyes darted to Landon, reading his face with a precision born from years of controlling what the world saw of him. "I hear," she said, her voice lilting as though speaking to a dinner guest, "that you've had a breakthrough." Naomi kept her gaze fixed on the floor. She could feel Marjorie watching her, the way a guard dog watches an intruder, silent but loaded. Vivian knelt slightly to Landon's level. "Say it for me, darling." Landon's lips pressed together. For a moment, Naomi thought he would resist. Then, in a breathy rasp, he formed the sound again. "Na. Oh. Me." Vivian's smile froze for half a second before she recovered. "Marvelous," she said brightly. "Absolutely marvelous." She didn't repeat the name. She didn't even glance toward Naomi. Instead, she turned to Marjorie. "We'll need to schedule a full evaluation with Dr. Harris and his team. And call Richard. This is significant." Within 24 hours, the Carrington mansion was a hive of movement. Doctors arrived with clipboards and cameras disguised as medical equipment. The living room was transformed into a stage. Fresh flowers, polished floors, a row of chairs angled toward the picture window, where sunlight would hit just so. Naomi was assigned to the far end of the house, polishing silver trays and staying out of the way. From the kitchen she could hear the muffled thrum of conversation. The polite laughter, the occasional burst of applause. It was only when she carried a tray of water glasses to the hallway outside the living room that she saw it. Vivian seated beside Landon in his chair, her hand draped lightly over his arm like a prop. Richard stood on the other side, his voice resonant as he addressed the small crowd of doctors, journalists, and friends of the family. "This," Richard said, gesturing to Landon, "is the result of years of dedication, resources, and the finest medical care money can provide. We've always believed in pushing boundaries for our son, and today we see the rewards." Naomi's stomach tightened. She heard nothing of the truth in his words. One of the doctors leaned forward. "Can you say something for us, Landon?" Landon's eyes flicked toward the back of the room. Toward her. Naomi froze, holding the tray midair. He turned back toward the doctor and spoke, voice trembling. "Nah." A ripple of polite confusion passed through the guests. Vivian laughed lightly, smoothing his hair. "He's experimenting with sounds," she explained. "What's important is that he's speaking at all." And just like that, the name was erased. The cameras flashed. The doctors murmured their approval. And Richard clasped Vivian's hand in a gesture rehearsed for years of galas and fundraisers. Naomi set the tray down on a sideboard and slipped out before anyone could notice her standing there. That evening, the news channels called it a miracle. Headlines glowed with words like breakthrough, first speech, triumph. Richard appeared in an interview, his voice warm with calculated sincerity. "We've invested everything in Landon's development," he said, leaning slightly toward the camera. "We knew with the right care he would find his voice." Not once did her name surface. Naomi sat in the staff pantry, the television casting a blue glow across her hands. Jonas, the gardener, stood behind her, arms folded. "They're acting like they built the boy themselves," he muttered. Naomi didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on Landon's image on the screen. How small he looked under the weight of the room. How his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The next morning, the media trucks arrived. Vivian greeted reporters at the gates, her smile wide enough to see from the road. Naomi kept to the laundry room, folding sheets with a precision that had nothing to do with fabric. But when she stepped into the hallway with a fresh stack, she caught sight of Landon being wheeled toward the front door. He looked up, saw her, and held her gaze for 3 long seconds before passing out of view. It was as if those 3 seconds were all he could offer in protest. By afternoon, the Carringtons had arranged a full press conference. The local news stations broadcast it live, Vivian and Richard seated on either side of Landon, the boy in the center like a rare painting being unveiled. Vivian's voice was honeyed as she thanked the medical experts who never gave up, and the generous donors who believed in our family's journey. Richard spoke of a future with endless possibilities. Naomi was not invited into the room. She stood in the shadow of the hallway arch, out of the camera's frame, listening to the polite clapping. When she dared to lean just far enough to see him, Landon's eyes flicked in her direction again. For a heartbeat, he seemed to stop listening to the speeches entirely. And that was when it happened. A young reporter, live streaming the event for his online followers, panned his phone across the room. In the far background, behind the gleaming rows of chairs, the lens caught the moment. Landon's lips moved, forming her name again. It wasn't loud. It wasn't staged. But the camera caught it clearly, the intimacy of it made sharper by the fact that Vivian's voice was droning over the microphones at the same time. The clip went unnoticed in the room. But the internet is made for noticing what others miss. By the time the event ended, the video was already climbing through shares and comments. Not Landon speaks, but who was Naomi? Upstairs in the staff quarters, Naomi's phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had tagged her in a post she hadn't made, under a headline she hadn't seen yet. Naomi's phone lit up with a flood of notifications. Her name appearing in posts from accounts she didn't follow. Comments multiplying faster than she could scroll. She didn't touch it at first, not trusting her hands to stay steady. When she finally opened one of the links, the video began mid-sentence. Vivian's voice smooth and practiced at the microphone. The camera wavered for a moment before panning across the room, catching Landon in profile. His lips moved once, slow, deliberate, and formed the syllables of her name. No sound. Just the shape of it. But clear enough that anyone could read it. The caption read, "Who is Naomi?" Below it, the comments came like a tide. "That's the maid, right? Why didn't they thank her? Looks like she's the reason he spoke. They're erasing her already." Classic. And mixed in, The darker current. They're letting the help get too close. Another race baiter looking for credit. She should be grateful she even has that job. Naomi put the phone down. The praise didn't feel safe, and the hate felt like a storm she'd seen brewing her whole life. By mid-afternoon, hashtags were trending. Who's Naomi? Naomi's name, and the one that made her chest tighten. She made him speak. People were sharing the clip alongside old photos someone had dug up from her public Facebook page. Naomi at the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the anniversary of Bloody Sunday. Naomi standing with her grandmother at the National Civil Rights Museum. Naomi at a community rally holding a sign that read "Dignity is a right." Supporters framed it as proof that she'd always been a fighter for justice. Detractors twisted it into an accusation. Activist Maid infiltrates wealthy family was a phrase that started popping up in certain corners of the internet. The mansion's atmosphere shifted as the news spread. Staff members whispered in corridors, their eyes darting toward Naomi with a mix of curiosity and caution. Margaret, the head housekeeper, walked past her twice without speaking. The cook, Gertie, pressed a small sandwich into her hands at lunch with a quiet, "Keep your head down, honey." Upstairs, Naomi caught sight of Vivian pacing on the phone, her voice tight and low. Words like containment and narrative carried down the hall. Richard was less subtle. She overheard him in his office, his voice sharp enough to cut through the heavy oak door. "I don't care what's trending. Find a way to make it disappear." But it didn't disappear. Every attempt to redirect the conversation only seemed to feed it. When the Carringtons posted a polished family photo with a caption about Landon's incredible medical team, the top comment was a screenshot from the clip with the words, "Say her name." By evening, Naomi's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from an unfamiliar number. "We see you. Don't let them erase you." It was unsigned. Minutes later, another message came from a different number. "You're making this about you. Walk away while you can." She deleted them both, but the unease stayed. In the dining room that night, the Carringtons sat at the far end of the table, while Naomi refilled glasses in silence. Vivian's smile was fixed but brittle, her eyes avoiding Naomi entirely. Landon's gaze, however, kept finding her. Each glance was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there, an anchor in a room that felt like it was tilting. The following morning, the tension broke into something more direct. Margaret appeared in the laundry room doorway, her voice tight. "Mr. Carrington wants to see you in his office." Naomi's hands stilled on the folded towel. Now? Now? The walk to the office felt longer than it should have, the carpet muffling her steps. She paused outside the heavy door, hearing nothing from inside, then knocked once. "Come in," Richard's voice called. He was seated behind his desk, a tumbler of amber liquid at his elbow, though it was barely past 10. The blinds were half closed, slicing the room into bars of light and shadow. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Naomi sat, her posture straight, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Richard didn't waste time. "You've seen the video."
Yes.
"You've seen the attention it's brought." His tone made the word sound like a disease. Naomi said nothing. "I'm a reasonable man," Richard continued. "I understand that this moment has people excited, but the narrative is getting away from us. From my family." She met his gaze evenly. "It's not a narrative." He said my name.
Richard's jaw tightened. "And people are reading into that. They're turning it into something it's not."
"It's exactly what it is," Naomi replied quietly. He spoke, and he chose what to say. Richard leaned back, studying her as though she were a problem to be solved. "You've worked in houses like this before. You understand discretion, privacy, the value of keeping certain things in the family. I also understand the value of the truth." His smile was slow and cold. "Truth is a matter of presentation, and right now the presentation is costing us." He reached into a drawer and slid an envelope across the desk. It was thick, the edges crisp. $500,000, he said. "Tax-free. You take it, you sign a non-disclosure agreement, and you walk away. Today." Naomi looked at the envelope, then back at him. "You want me to disappear? I want to protect my family." Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "From what?" "From the fact that your son's first word wasn't for you." Richard's eyes narrowed, his hands steepling on the desk. "From chaos. From people like you turning this into a spectacle." Naomi's pulse pounded, but her voice stayed calm. "People like me?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She pushed the envelope back toward him. "I'm not for sale." For a moment Richard simply stared at her. Then he leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. You'll regret that. Naomi stood to leave, but before her hand reached the doorknob, she heard Richard pick up his phone and say, "Make the arrangements. She's gone by morning." The air in Richard Carrington's office had the weight of a sealed vault. Heavy blinds cut the sunlight into neat, sterile strips across the floor, and the faint scent of whiskey lingered like an afterthought from his untouched glass. Naomi didn't sit back down. She stood across from him, her hands steady at her sides, eyes fixed on his. The thick envelope lay between them, an unspoken challenge. "You're offering me $500,000, she said, her voice measured. "I'm offering you freedom," Richard corrected, "from the chaos you've accidentally invited into this house and into your life. That kind of attention never ends well." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "For me, or for you, for both of us," he said smoothly. "But especially for you. I know how this works. The internet moves on quickly, but the people who hate you, they don't. Take the money. Start over. Let this fade." Her fingers curled slightly, not in fear but in quiet resolve. "You think I want attention, Mr. Carrington. I don't. I want him to be seen. Not paraded when it's convenient, but seen for who he is and what he can do." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, studying her like an opponent across a chessboard. "And you think you're the one to make that happen?" Naomi didn't flinch. "I am the one who made that happen." A flicker of something passed across his face. Not quite anger, not quite surprise, but a recognition that she wasn't playing the game the way most people in her position would. "You're here because I allowed you to be," he said finally, his voice cooling to something almost metallic. "That can change." "I know." She stepped forward, her hands resting lightly on the back of the chair opposite his desk. "But you can't change the fact that he said my name first. That moment belongs to him, and I'm not going to let you bury it, because it doesn't fit your version of the story." His jaw tightened. "You are making a mistake." "Maybe," Naomi allowed, "but it's mine to make." Silence stretched between them, taut and unyielding. Richard broke it with a dry, humorless laugh. "You could have taken the money and disappeared into something better than you've ever had. Instead, you're going to leave here with nothing but the wrong kind of reputation." Naomi met his gaze. "I've had the wrong kind of reputation before. It never stopped me from doing what was right." The corner of his mouth twitched, but it wasn't a smile. "You'll regret this," he said, the words slow and deliberate, as if each one had been sharpened before being spoken. Naomi stepped back, her voice steady. "If I do, at least it won't be because I sold the truth." She turned toward the door, her hand brushing the brass handle. Behind her, Richard picked up his phone. His voice was calm, almost casual. "Make the arrangements," he said to whoever was on the other end. "She's gone by morning." Naomi didn't pause. She left his office without a word, the sound of the latch clicking shut behind her ringing louder in her ears than his threat. That night, the mansion felt colder. Staff members avoided her eyes. Margaret passed her in the hall without the usual perfunctory nod. Even Gertie's warm evening baby carried an edge of worry. In her small room on the staff floor, Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, her suitcase open but empty. She didn't start packing. She knew the moment she did, she'd be surrendering, and she wasn't ready for that. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "They'll come for you before you're ready. Stay sharp." No name, no context. She deleted it but felt its warning settle in her chest. She thought about calling a friend, maybe even her sister in Birmingham, but decided against it. She didn't want to pull anyone else into the Undertow building around her. Instead, she lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about Landon, how he had looked at her in the press conference, how he had spoken her name like it was something worth the effort. If she left now, she knew exactly what would happen. The Carringtons would replace her with someone quiet, someone compliant, someone who would never look Landon in the eye as an equal. His progress would be absorbed into their version of events, repackaged as a medical miracle delivered by their wealth and foresight. By midnight, her decision was made. She would not leave willingly. The morning came early. The knock at her door was brisk, not tentative. Margaret stood in the hall, flanked by two men in dark suits. Private security, the kind that spoke rarely, but moved with practiced efficiency. Behind them, Naomi's suitcase sat zipped, her few personal items tucked neatly inside. "It's time," Margaret said, her voice flat. Naomi stepped into the hall, her eyes scanning the men's faces. They weren't unkind, but they were unreadable. Their hands rested near their belts, not in threat but as a reminder. I didn't pack that, Naomi said, nodding toward the suitcase. Housekeeping did, Margaret replied. Mr. Carrington asked that you be escorted off the property immediately. Naomi's gaze drifted past them, toward the far end of the hall, toward Landon's room. His door was closed, but she felt the pull of it like a current. I'll walk myself out, Naomi said. That's not an option. One of the security men replied, his tone clipped but calm. Naomi inhaled slowly, her mind already working. She couldn't stop them from taking her off the property, but maybe, just maybe, she could make one last move before the door closed behind her for good. As they led her toward the stairs, she heard a faint sound from above, her name, spoken with effort, cutting through the still morning air. The sound of her name cut through the hallway like a thread pulling her backward. Naomi stopped mid-step. The two security men turned their heads instinctively, eyes narrowing, as if they weren't sure they'd heard what they thought they had. Margaret froze entirely, her lips parting in disbelief. It came again, clearer this time, though still rough with effort. Now. Her chest tightened. The voice was coming from upstairs. Landon's room. Naomi's instinct screamed to move toward him, but one of the guards stepped slightly in her path. We need to keep moving, ma'am. Did you hear that? She asked, her voice steady but edged. The guard didn't answer, but his eyes betrayed it. Yes, he had heard it, and no, he wasn't going to acknowledge it. Then came another sound, heavier this time, the faint whir of wheelchair wheels turning, not pushed by a nurse or staff member, but by their own motor under deliberate control. Naomi's pulse spiked. From the top of the main staircase, Landon appeared, alone. His chair rolled forward in steady bursts, his hands gripping the rims. His posture wasn't perfect, slightly hunched from the effort, but the intent was unmistakable. Staff members appeared from doorways and corridors, drawn by the sound and the sight. Gasps rippled through them like a wave. Landon. Vivian's voice came sharp from the far end of the hall. She appeared seconds later, heels clicking against the marble, eyes wide with something between fear and outrage. Stop this immediately. You'll hurt yourself. He didn't stop. The wheels bumped gently against the edge of the carpet runner as he reached the top of the stairs. For a moment, Naomi's heart seized. If he tipped forward, there would be no catching him in time. But then, in a move that seemed almost rehearsed, Landon reached down to the small latch on the side of his chair, released it, and with both hands pushed himself upright. The air went still. It wasn't a perfect rise. His legs trembled, his balance wavered, but it was real. He stood, the marble floor beneath him, carrying the weight of something it had never held before. A murmur swept through the staff. One of the younger maids clutched the doorway like she might fall. Vivian's voice cracked for the first time Naomi had ever heard. Landon, sit down. Right now. He didn't. Step by slow, deliberate step, he began moving toward Naomi. Each footfall was a battle, his knees buckling slightly, his arms twitching as they compensated, but he kept going. The guard stepped back instinctively, as if giving him room was the only right thing to do. Margaret's hands had risen to her mouth, her eyes darting between Naomi and the boy. When Landon reached her, his breathing was shallow, but his eyes burned with the same focus she'd seen in him the first day she walked into his room. He reached for her hand. She met him halfway, her fingers curling around his. The grip wasn't strong, but it was steady, and it was. Gasps deepened around them. Someone whispered, "I've never seen him before," stopping short. Naomi's throat tightened, but she kept her voice low, speaking only to him. "You did this." Landon's lips moved again. "No. We." It was more than a word. It was a claim. A refusal to let this be written as hers alone or his alone. It was theirs. Vivian stood frozen a few feet away, her perfectly composed exterior cracking at the edges. The tremor in her hands betrayed what her voice wouldn't. "Landon, please. This isn't the time." He turned his head toward her, the movement deliberate, and for the first time in Naomi's presence, she saw him look at his mother not with obedience, but with defiance. Naomi wanted to hold on to the moment forever. But in the periphery, she caught a small furtive movement. One of the junior staffers, a young man who worked in maintenance, had pulled out his phone. At first she thought he was just documenting the moment for himself, but the subtle angle of his wrist and the faint red recording light told her otherwise. He was filming. Her instinct was to tell him to stop. But the thought caught in her throat. If this moment stayed in this house, it would be rewritten by morning. Outside of it, Maybe, just maybe, it could remain whole. The phone lowered slightly, the young man glancing around to be sure no one had noticed. Then he slipped it back into his pocket and disappeared into the crowd. Landon's knees gave a faint wobble. Naomi shifted her stance to steady him. "You should sit," she said softly. He blinked once agreement and allowed her to guide him back into his chair. But the way he kept her hand as he sat was a statement in itself. Vivian's eyes moved to Naomi finally, but they didn't hold gratitude. They held something harder to read. Resentment mixed with the kind of fear people have when they realize a truth they can't control is about to leave the room. Richard wasn't there yet, but Naomi could already imagine what would happen when he was. And she was right. Because less than 2 hours later, the clip, shaky, grainy, unpolished, appeared online. It showed Landon, unassisted, walking toward her. No music, no commentary, just the sound of his uneven steps and the murmur of shocked onlookers. It began climbing through retweets and shares almost instantly. By the time Naomi realized it was out there, it had already been reposted to Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. The captions were immediate and unanimous. "The boy who walked for Naomi." Naomi stared at her phone, watching the view count explode, unaware that the Carringtons were already making calls to find out who had leaked it, and how to make sure it never happened again. By the time Naomi woke the next morning, the video had already crossed the 5 million view mark. It was everywhere. TikTok edits with swelling music, Instagram reels with bold captions, Twitter threads dissecting the symbolism of a boy walking toward the only person who saw him. Someone had slowed the clip down, frame by frame, highlighting the exact moment Landon's trembling hand reached for hers. The internet named her before the Carringtons ever would. The woman who made the millionaire's son walk. Hashtags trended across multiple platforms. "Walk for Naomi." "Truth over wealth." "Say her name, Naomi." The praise came from everywhere. Disability rights advocates, civil rights organizations, and ordinary people who saw in her a reminder of what it meant to be human in a world obsessed with image. But the tide carried more than applause. By noon, the Carrington PR machine was sputtering. News crews gathered outside the mansion gates. One headline read, "Why wasn't she in the first press conference?" Another, "Carrington family accused of erasing black woman who helped son walk." On the steps of a downtown news station, a protest formed. Handmade signs reading, "Let her speak," and "Credit Naomi" waved in the warm Georgia air. A smaller sign at the edge of the crowd, cut sharper than the rest, "Money didn't heal him. She did." Inside the mansion, the tension was palpable. Staff whispered behind closed doors. Margaret walked briskly from room to room, muttering about damage control. Vivian hadn't been seen since sunrise, and Richard's voice could be heard through the office door, sharp, clipped, the language of someone trying to negotiate with an unstoppable storm. In the staff quarters, Naomi sat on the edge of her bed, the light from her phone illuminating her face as she scrolled through messages from strangers. Some were kind offers to tell her story, invitations to speak at events. Others were not. "You don't belong in that house. This is why they don't hire your kind. Better watch your back." She deleted the last one, but its shadow lingered. Jonas, the gardener, knocked softly on her open door. "You see the news?" She glanced up. Hard to miss it. He stepped inside, lowering his voice. "They can't stop this now. Even if they try, too many people saw." Naomi looked at him, her tone cautious. "And you think that makes me safer?" Jonas didn't answer immediately. His silence was enough. By late afternoon, national outlets had picked up the story. CNN ran a segment showing the clip alongside footage from the Carringtons' earlier press conference, contrasting the erasure of her name with the raw, unpolished truth of the walk. Commentators debated the racial undertones, the ethics of wealthy families controlling narratives, and the power of viral media to force accountability. But with the attention came something more dangerous, a hunger for details. Journalists began digging into Naomi's past. Old photos resurfaced, her at a protest after a police shooting, her holding a banner at a voting rights march, her speaking at a community center. To some, these images painted her as a hero. To others, they marked her as a political agitator. By evening, the crowd outside the Carrington gates had doubled. A line of police cruisers idled nearby, the blue lights spinning slowly against the dusk. Chants rose and fell. "Say her name." "Let Naomi speak." Inside, Naomi was summoned to the kitchen, where Vivian stood with arms folded, her expression tighter than Naomi had ever seen. "You've caused quite a disruption," Vivian said. "I didn't post the video," Naomi replied. "But you didn't stop it." Naomi's voice stayed calm. And why would I? It's the truth.
Vivian's smile was brittle. The truth is complicated, and you are simplifying it for an audience that doesn't understand the nuances of our situation.
Naomi almost laughed at the word our. Your situation, she corrected gently. Vivian's eyes hardened. Do you have any idea what this is doing to my family? Yes, Naomi said. And do you have any idea what your family tried to do to mine? For a moment, they stood in silence, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between them. Then Vivian turned sharply and left, her heels echoing down the hall. That night, Naomi scrolled through her phone again. Amid the noise of praise and hate, one message stopped her cold. It came from a private account with no profile picture.
They won't let you in. Watch your back.
She stared at the words, her thumb hovering over the screen. Something about the phrasing felt different from the earlier threats. Less like online bluster and more like a warning from someone who knew. Before she could decide how to respond, another message appeared from the same account. He's not the only one who needs you to survive this. Her pulse quickened. She typed back a single question mark, but the account had already vanished. She set the phone down, her gaze drifting toward the window. Beyond it, the faint glow of protest signs flickered in the night. She could hear the distant chant of her name. The weight of it settled on her. She wasn't just a maid in a wealthy house anymore. She was a symbol, and symbols, she knew, could be powerful and dangerous. Somewhere in the shadows beyond the protest lights, a figure stood watching the mansion, not holding a sign, not chanting, just watching. And Naomi had no idea if they were there to protect her or to make her disappear. By the second morning after the video went viral, Naomi's phone was no longer a device. It was a live wire. Every few seconds, it buzzed with alerts, messages, mentions, tags from strangers who felt entitled to her story. She had learned to skim quickly, eyes catching only enough to know which messages to delete without opening. The hateful ones were easy to spot. Go back to where you came from. You're making this about race when it's about health. The only reason anyone cares about you is because you're trying to tear down a good family. The praise was harder to handle, because it came mixed with expectation. You're the voice for all of us now. Don't back down, Naomi. Tell them everything. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the support. It was that each message seemed to push her further into a role she hadn't asked for, one she couldn't step out of without feeling like she was betraying the people who believed in her. By midday, the threats moved from digital to physical. Jonas handed her a stack of mail that had been delivered to the staff entrance. Among the junk flyers and a single card from her sister was a plain white envelope with her name scrawled in thick black marker. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No salutation, just 4 words, written in uneven block letters. Leave before it's too late. She stood there holding it, the paper trembling slightly between her fingers. Jonas looked over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. That come through the regular mail? She nodded. Then someone had to know your name, and this address. They both knew what that meant. It wasn't random internet noise anymore. This was someone close enough to the house to know where she worked. Maybe even someone who'd been inside. That night, Naomi sat at the small desk in her staff quarters, staring at the letter. Outside her window, the glow of protest signs flickered in the distance, muffled chants rising and falling like waves. She opened her laptop, hesitated, then typed Landon's name into the search bar of a popular social platform. His official account came up first. Clean, curated posts, likely managed by his parents' PR team. But buried further down was a private account with a single profile picture of sunlight spilling through blinds. She clicked. It was empty except for one post. A blurry image of a hand holding a laminated card with the word yes. The caption read, "You know." Her heart skipped. She followed the account. Seconds later, a notification popped up. Message request from Landon Carr. She opened it. Naomi, I'm trying to tell you. The message stopped there, cut off. Another appeared seconds later. They blocked my main account. Using this. Not much time. She typed quickly. I'm here. What do you want to tell me? There was a long pause.
Not safe. For you.
Before she could reply, a final message came through. They're planning something. And then the account vanished. Deleted. She stared at the blank screen, her pulse loud in her ears. If it was really Landon, and she believed it was, that meant he had found a way to communicate despite his parents' control. But it also meant someone must have noticed and shut it down immediately. The next day, Naomi decided to make the short drive to her apartment during her midday break, just long enough to pick up a few things she needed. The protests outside the gates had grown louder, and the police presence had doubled. Cameras swung toward her as she slipped into her old sedan. She kept her head down and drove. The streets were bright with afternoon sun, the kind of day that looked harmless in pictures. When she returned an hour later, the air around the mansion felt sharper. Jonas met her near the staff entrance, his expression grim. "You need to see this," he said, nodding toward the small staff parking lot. Her stomach tightened before she even looked. The driver's side of her car was covered in thick, dripping red paint, not neat letters, but a smeared handprint near the door handle, streaks running down the window like blood in a bad dream. The hood bore 3 large words scrawled in jagged lines. "We're watching you." The security camera above the lot blinked steadily, recording the scene, but Naomi didn't trust for a second that anyone inside the mansion would hand over the footage. A small group of staff had gathered at a distance, whispering. Margaret stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Naomi stepped closer to her car, the heat from the sun warming the tacky paint. She reached out, touched the edge of one letter, and felt it come away on her fingertip. Jonas's voice was low, broad daylight. "That's a message." She didn't look at him. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I got it loud and clear." Behind her, someone in the crowd murmured, "This is going too far." "It already had." As Naomi turned to walk back toward the staff entrance, her phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. "You're running out of time." Naomi stared at the red paint on her car for the last time, then turned her back to it. Fear had tried its best to seep into her bones, but she'd spent too many years learning how to live with shadows to let this one dictate her next move. That night she sat in her staff quarters with the blinds drawn and the desk lamp low. On her laptop screen, she drafted a simple post. "This isn't just about me. This is about who gets to be seen, who gets to be heard, and who gets to decide. Join us this Saturday, Freedom Square, 2 p.m. She attached a photo of the picture board she'd used with Landon, the yes card front and center, and hit post. The message spread faster than she'd expected. By the next morning, her phone buzzed nonstop with confirmations from disability advocates, racial justice organizations, and strangers offering to help with logistics. A local nonprofit offered to set up a small stage and sound system. Vivian saw the post too. Naomi caught her in the hall, phone in hand, jaw tight. "You're making a spectacle," she said coldly. "I'm making a stand," Naomi replied. Vivian's eyes narrowed. "You're playing with fire." "Maybe, but at least I'm not pretending there's no smoke." On the morning of the rally, the mansion buzzed with nervous energy. The Carringtons' lawyers had been in and out all week, their conversations low and urgent. Staff avoided Naomi's gaze, but she noticed the small ways they showed support. Jonas slipping her an extra set of water bottles, Gertie packing sandwiches for her just in case. What Naomi didn't know was that upstairs, Landon had his own plan. With the help of 2 sympathetic staff members, the youngest Maid, Kira, and the night security guard, Daniel, he had been practicing short bursts of walking in his room late at night when the house was quiet. Now they were helping him into a plain hoodie and sneakers, covering the wheelchair with a blanket to disguise it as unused equipment, and slipping him out through a side entrance while the Carringtons were distracted with a phone interview. By the time Naomi arrived at Freedom Square, the plaza was already filling. Signs waved in the air. "Stage or right, say his first word. Truth over wealth." She stepped onto the stage as cheers rolled through the crowd. A sea of faces, black, white, young, old, all looking up at her.
"Thank you for being here," she began, her voice steady but alive with emotion.
"This isn't just my story. And it's not just one boy's story. It's about every time someone was told to stay in their place, every time a voice was silenced because it didn't fit the version of events the powerful wanted told." Applause broke like a wave, but then came a ripple through the crowd. Murmurs, pointing, heads turning toward the far end of the plaza. Naomi shaded her eyes against the midday sun and froze. There, moving slowly between the rows of people, was Landon, not in his chair, not being carried, walking. Each step was deliberate, his knees trembling slightly, but his chin was lifted. Kira walked just behind him, ready to steady him if he faltered, while Daniel kept a protective distance, scanning the crowd. The cheers shifted to something deeper, a roar mixed with tears and disbelief. Phones shot into the air. People reached out as he passed, but he kept his focus on Naomi. When he reached the base of the stage, Daniel gave him a hand up the short set of steps. Landon crossed to her slowly, his breathing labored but his eyes clear. The microphone picked up his voice, quiet but steady. I'm here because she saw me. The crowd erupted. Naomi's throat tightened, and for a moment she forgot every speech she'd ever planned. She simply put a hand on his shoulder and let the moment breathe. This, she said into the mic, her voice carrying over the plaza, is what happens when you give someone a chance instead of a cage, when you give them dignity instead of pity. The chant began at the back of the crowd and rolled forward. Stand with Naomi. Stand with Naomi. Landon managed a faint smile, and for the first time, Naomi saw what it looked like when he wasn't under the weight of his parents' control, when his choices were his own. But the swell of hope broke as the sound of sirens cut through the chants. 2 police cruisers pulled up at the edge of the square, lights flashing. Officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the stage before locking on Naomi. A man in plain clothes, a detective, approached with a folded paper in his hand. His voice carried over the crowd. Naomi Brooks? The chants faltered into uneasy murmurs. Yes, she said, her voice steady even as her heart thudded. He held up the paper. We have a warrant for your arrest. The crowd gasped, shouts of protest ringing out. Kira stepped instinctively closer to Landon, her eyes darting to the officers. Naomi kept her gaze on the detective. On what charge? Endangering the welfare of a disabled person, he said flatly. Gasps turned into outrage. Signs waved higher. Someone yelled, "This is a setup." Another voice, "We're recording everything." Naomi glanced at Landon. His expression was a mix of shock and fury. He shook his head slowly, as if to tell her not to go. But the officers were already moving forward, their presence heavy on the stage. As one reached for her arm, a voice from the crowd shouted, "We have proof she saved him," and Naomi turned to see a man holding up a tablet. A video paused on the screen that could change everything. The ride from the rally stage to the police station was short but suffocating. Naomi sat in the back of the cruiser, hands cuffed, the metallic click of each bump in the road pressing into her wrists. Through the window she caught glimpses of protesters trying to follow on foot, their voices swallowed by the sirens. At the station, the charge was read aloud, endangering the welfare of a disabled person. The words felt absurd in the sterile light of the booking room, but Naomi knew exactly what they meant. This wasn't about safety, it was about control and rape. Within hours, the story broke nationwide. Cable news flashed her mugshot next to a still of Landon walking toward her. Social media boiled over, the hashtags multiplying. Commentators didn't dance around the racial undertones. Many said outright that no white staff member would have been accused for the same actions. The case moved fast. Too fast. The Carringtons wanted it over before the tide of public opinion grew stronger. Within 2 weeks, Naomi found herself seated at the defendant's table in a packed Atlanta courtroom. The press gallery buzzed, cameras flashing whenever she lifted her head. The prosecution built their case around medical authority. They brought in Landon's longtime physician, who spoke in grave tones about the dangers of unsanctioned physical strain and the risk posed by individuals without specialized training. He never once looked Naomi in the eye, but the defense countered with something stronger: human truth. Witnesses included Jonas, Gertie, and 2 other staff members who had seen the quiet, patient way Naomi worked with Landon when no one else bothered. They spoke of his growing independence, his first smile, his first word. Still, the room held its breath for one witness in particular. When Landon entered, escorted by Daniel, the air shifted. He was walking again, slower than he had at the rally, but without fear. The jurors leaned forward. Vivian kept her gaze fixed on the polished wood of the prosecution table, while Richard sat rigid, jaw clenched. Landon took the stand. His voice was halting but deliberate, the assistive microphone amplifying each word. "She didn't endanger me," he began, eyes fixed on the jury. "She saved me." A pause. He drew in a slow breath. "Not just walking. She saw me. No one else did." The courtroom was silent, except for the hum of the lights. "She gave me my life." The defense attorney asked no more questions. They didn't need to. The closing arguments painted 2 starkly different pictures. The prosecution warned of reckless interference and the risk of collapse. The defense spoke of dignity denied and freedom restored. When the jury left to deliberate, Naomi sat in stillness, her hands folded in her lap. She tried not to look at the clock, but every tick was a reminder that her life was being weighed in another room. It took less than an hour. The foreperson stood, a small slip of paper in hand. The judge's voice carried through the quiet. On the charge of endangering the welfare of a disabled person, how do you find the defendant? The foreperson's reply was steady. Not guilty. For a moment, Naomi didn't move. Then the sound hit her. Cheers from the gallery, clapping, the shuffle of people standing. The judge banged the gavel for order, but it barely dented the wave of relief flooding the room. She turned slightly and saw Landon smiling, not the faint, cautious smile she'd first seen, but something open and unguarded. He mouthed the words, "Told you." Outside the courthouse, the steps were lined with supporters. Signs waved, cameras flashed, chants rose into the bright afternoon air. Naomi and Landon emerged together, walking side by side. Hands reached out from the crowd, cell phones angled for photos. The noise was overwhelming, but it was joyous. She felt the warmth of the sun on her face, and the weight of Landon's presence beside her. A reporter pushed forward, microphone extended. "Naomi, what's next for you?" She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a different voice cut through. A woman standing just off to the side, her tone low enough to be meant for Naomi alone. "I represent a family in New York," the woman said quickly. "They've been watching everything. They want to hire you, but not to clean." Naomi blinked, the words catching her off guard. "Then for what?" The woman smiled faintly. "To change a life." Naomi glanced at Landon, then back at the woman, realizing her fight might not be ending at all, just moving to a new battlefield. Because silence protects the powerful, and stories like this only live if we keep telling them. If you believe no voice should be erased, type yes. If this broke your heart, subscribe so we never look away again.